Some folks say a prayer can get lost on its way up to heaven, but others, well, they find their way right to the person who needs to hear them most. That winter came on hard and fast in Montana territory. It was the kind of cold that peels a person back to who they really are. Inside a little cabin, hardly wide enough for a man to stretch out his arms, a little girl put a pencil to a piece of paper. She wrote down some words that were about to change 3 lives for good. She had no idea that letter would end up traveling 15 miles by pure chance. She surely did not know it would land on the porch of a man who had long since given up on prayers being answered. All she knew was that her mama worked so hard her hands would crack and bleed. She knew other kids had daddies to lift them up on their strong shoulders, but hers was just a memory. So she drew 3 little stick people holding hands and sent it to someone she had never met, but needed more than anything. What happened after that is just proof that the best kinds of gifts show up right when you are about to lose all hope. The wind knew every crack in that little cabin's walls, like it had been planning its visit for a long time. Carla Welch was on her knees by the fireplace, feeding it small pieces of pine she had gathered before the sun came up. Her hands moved quick and sure, the way a person's do when they cannot afford a single wasted motion. She was 29 years old, but the frontier had a knack for adding years to a woman's face that a calendar could not. She kept her dark blonde hair pulled back in a braid so tight it sometimes gave her a headache. But loose hair just gets in the way, and anything that got in the way cost her time she did not have. The cabin was tiny, just 12 feet by 14 feet. It was one room with one bed that she and her daughter shared. There was a table she had hammered together herself out of some lumber she got in trade for a month's worth of washing clothes. It had 3 chairs, but only 2 of them ever got sat in. The pine walls were raw and unfinished. When the wind blew just right, she could see slivers of daylight peeking through. She had tried stuffing the cracks with old rags and mud, but a Montana winter always finds a way in. Her daughter Tinsley let out a cough from the bed. The sound rattled deep in her little chest, like a handful of pebbles shaken in a tin can. Carla froze, her hand still holding a piece of wood. She started counting the seconds between each cough, the way some women might count their blessings. 5 seconds. That was good. Better than 3 anyway. 3 seconds meant a long night of breathing in steam and saying prayers that just seemed to hit the ceiling and fall right back down. "I am okay, Mama," Tinsley said, her voice sounding small but stubborn. Carla got up and walked to the bed. She put the back of her hand on her little girl's forehead. It was warm, but not burning up. Not yet. Tinsley was 5 years old. She had light brown hair that curled up at the ends and big green eyes that saw everything. She saw when her mama skipped a meal to make the food last longer. She saw when the woodpile out back got too low, too fast. And she saw the other children laughing, a kind of easy laugh that comes when you are not carrying all the world's worries on your own shoulders. "I know you are, sweet girl," Carla said, pulling the thin blanket up. "But you get your rest all the same." Outside the window, the snow had started falling again. November in that part of the country did not bother asking for permission. It just showed up and stayed for months. Carla watched it coming down, doing the math in her head. She had laundry to get back to 3 different families tomorrow. There was Mrs. Dickerson, who ran the boarding house, and the Stein family ranch, which was 6 long miles to the south. Then there was the new school teacher, Miss Fields, who always paid on time but expected every stitch to be perfect. Her husband Thomas had been gone for 2 years now. His horse got spooked while crossing a river during the spring thaw. They found him 3 miles downstream, with the reins still clutched in his hand. He had been a good man, a sweet man, but he was not built for a hard life. He left her with the cabin, $14, and a daughter who had his exact same eyes. The $14 was gone in 6 weeks. Carla learned fast that the frontier does not have a soft spot for widows. She started taking in laundry. She patched up torn clothes. She cleaned cabins for other families who had enough money to hire help. She hauled her own water up from the creek, even when the edges were frozen solid. Her hands told the story of lye soap and ice-cold water. They were rough and red, with thick calluses right across the palms. She was not pretty like the ladies in the magazines, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet strength that made fellas tip their hats when she walked by. She did not smile much these days. A smile took energy, and she had to save every bit she had. That night, long after Tinsley was asleep, Carla sat at the little table with her numbers book. In the flickering candlelight, she added up figures that never seemed to get any bigger. The laundry money was just enough for cornmeal, salt pork, and oil for the lamp. Sometimes she could afford butter, but eggs were a real luxury. The Stein Ranch had told her she could have steady work, but that would mean leaving Tinsley by herself all day long. She just could not do it. Not with that cough, not with winter bearing down on them. She shut the book and just watched the candle flame dance. The tiredness had settled deep into her bones, like it was a part of her now. But she did not cry. Crying was another thing she just could not afford. About 15 miles to the northeast, in a big ranch house built for a whole family, a man named Vance Gilmore sat all by himself. He was in a leather chair near a fireplace so big you could stand up in it. The room around him was full of nice things bought with money from cattle, smart land deals, and years of hard work. There were thick rugs on the pine floors and shelves full of books he had actually read. The furniture was heavy and well made, shipped from back east, and every single piece of it sat in silence. Vance was 34 years old, so he had broad shoulders from a life of ranching, dark hair that was getting a little long, and gray eyes that did not miss a thing. His hands were calloused, even though he was a rich man. That was because he still rode his own fence lines, still broke his own horses, and still worked right alongside his crew. Out here, respect is something you earn with sweat, not dollars. He had gotten the ranch from his father and made it bigger by buying up land when other folks got scared during the bad winters. He owned 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, and had enough money to go live in a big city like San Francisco if he wanted to. He always kept his herd smaller than what the land could feed in the good years. Vance was a man who believed in saving for a hard winter, not in showing off. But he did not want to live in a city. He liked the open space, the kind of quiet where you do not have to be anybody but yourself. He had been married one time for just a little while 8 years ago. Rebecca was a banker's daughter from Billings. She was beautiful and proper, and she thought living on a ranch would be like something romantic. Well, it sure was not. She packed her bags after just 10 months, saying she was as lonely as she was bored. Their split was quiet and clean. She was married again inside of a year. He was not. In the years after, Vance had gotten used to his own company. He took his meals by himself. He read his books by himself. He slept on one side of a bed made for two. The only folks on his payroll were a housekeeper who came 2 times a week and a ranch foreman who stayed in the bunkhouse. He liked it that way. People always needed you to explain things. Being alone asked nothing of him. But here lately, the quiet had started to feel less like peace and more like something was missing. He got up and walked over to the window, watching the snow come down thick and steady. His own childhood was a world away from this. He grew up in a little 2-room shack out in Wyoming, with a mother whose hands were worked to the bone and a father who would drink up any spare dollar. His little sister, Lily, passed on from pneumonia when she was 6. They just did not have the money for a doctor. His mother held Lily all through the fever, singing church hymns until her singing was the only thing you could hear. Vance left home at 15, pushed cattle on drives, saved every last penny, and swore he would never be poor again. He made good on that promise, but being successful came with its own price. Nobody ever talks about that. It builds fences just as solid as the money itself. He walked back to his chair and picked up a book, but his eyes were not seeing the words. Outside, the wind howled a lonely song. Inside, the fire popped and crackled. And somewhere, not too far away, a little girl was writing a letter that was going to find its way to him in 3 days. Back in the cabin, Tinsley coughed again. Carla got up from the table and went over to the bed. She sat on the edge and put a hand on her daughter's back, feeling the tiny body shake with the effort. "Mama," Tinsley whispered after the coughing fit passed, "do you reckon Santa Claus knows where we live?" Carla felt a lump form in her throat. "I think he knows where everybody lives, sweet girl, even way out here." Tinsley was quiet for a second, thinking that over. "If I asked him for something, you think he would bring it?" Carla gently stroked her daughter's hair. "You can ask him for anything your heart desires. Not toys," Tinsley said, her voice all serious. "Something better." What could be better than toys? But Tinsley's eyes had already drifted shut, the long day finally pulling her down into sleep. Carla sat there for a long time until her daughter's breathing was slow and steady. Then she went back to the table. She blew out the candle to save what was left of it and sat in the dark, listening to the wind teach its hard lessons. Tomorrow she would get up and wash clothes until her hands were raw. She would force a smile for customers who did not really see her as a person, but just as a pair of working hands. She would count every coin and figure out how to make it last longer than it should. She would come home and listen to Tinsley's breathing and pray that cough did not get any worse. She would survive. It was the only thing she knew how to do. But Lord, she was so very tired of being strong all by herself. This trading post in the little settlement of Clement Springs was where everything happened. Every Tuesday and Friday, folks would ride in from their ranches and cabins to pick up supplies, get their mail, and trade gossip that moved faster than any telegraph wire. The building was made of old, weathered wood with a porch that sagged right in the middle. But when you stepped inside, it smelled of coffee grounds, new leather, and the faint hope of a better day. Carla walked in on a Friday morning late in November, holding Tinsley's small hand in hers. She had made her deliveries and earned just enough for some cornmeal and molasses. If she was lucky, maybe a little jar of honey to soothe Tinsley's cough. The place was bustling with people. A group of ranchers stood by the wood stove, talking low about the price of cattle. Some of the women were looking at bolts of fabric they knew they could not afford. Little kids had their noses pressed right up against the glass jars full of candy. Carla guided Tinsley through the crowd, quiet as a shadow, not looking to be seen. She was looking over cornmeal prices when Tinsley gave her hand a little tug. "Mama, look!" Carla glanced where her daughter was pointing, over at the counter where a man was paying his bill. He was a tall fellow with broad shoulders wearing a thick wool coat and work gloves. He had dark hair and a strong jaw, the kind of man that makes a woman take a second look. But Carla had taught herself not to pay that any mind. She knew that looking just led to hoping, and hoping always ended in a letdown. But Tinsley did not have that kind of worry. "Howdy," she said clear as a bell, taking a step forward. The man looked down, and the serious look on his face softened right up. "Well, howdy there to you. I am Tinsley. I am 5 years old. My mama does the best laundry in the whole Montana territory." Carla felt her face get hot. "Tinsley, do not bother the man." "She is no bother at all," he said, and his voice was low and steady. He looked straight at Carla then, and she saw that he had gray eyes that looked like they knew how to size things up real good. "Vance Gilmore. I run the Double G Ranch northeast of here." Carla knew that name. Everybody did. The Gilmore place was the biggest in the territory. "Carla Welch, and I am sorry for my daughter being so forward." Do not be sorry for friendliness. That is a rare thing these days. He paused for a moment, then looked back at Tinsley. 5 years old, that is a fine age. "How old are you?" Tinsley asked. "Tinsley," Carla said, a little sharp, but Vance just smiled. 34. And I reckon that is old enough for little ones to start asking about it." "That is not old," Tinsley said, real serious. "My papa was 28 when he passed, and Mama says that was way too young." The words just hung there in the quiet store, so simple and so heavy. Carla's hand got tighter on Tinsley's shoulder. "We ought to finish our shopping." Vance's face did not change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Maybe it was understanding, or maybe he knew that same kind of hurt. "Of course. Good day to you, Mrs. Welch." She gave a little nod and steered Tinsley back toward the cornmeal, her heart pounding for reasons she did not care to think about. Behind her, she could hear Vance say a few more words to the shopkeeper. Then the bell on the door jingled, and he was gone. "I liked him," Tinsley declared. "He did not talk to me like I was a baby." "That was nice of him," Carla said, choosing her words with care. "But we do not talk to strangers like they are old friends, you understand? He is not a stranger now. I know his name." Carla did not have the fight in her to argue with the way a 5-year-old thinks. She bought what she needed, counting out her coins twice just to be sure, and left the trading post with Tinsley chattering on about the candy jars she had seen but knew better than to ask for. 3 days later, Carla was hauling water up from the creek when she saw a fresh stack of firewood next to her cabin. It was not just a little bit either, but enough to last 2 weeks if she was careful with it. She put the buckets down and just stared. trying to figure it out. She had not ordered any firewood. She surely could not afford to. Inside the cabin, Tinsley was all wrapped up in a blanket, scratching out pictures on a little slate. Carla knelt down next to her. "Did anybody stop by today?" "No, Mama. I stayed inside the whole time, just like you told me." Carla went back out on the porch and looked at the wood again. It was good, solid oak, split clean and stacked neat as you please. There was no note, no word of who left it. She stood there in the cold air, her pride wrestling with what was practical. She knew she should find whoever did it and make sure to pay them, but she needed that wood something fierce, and it was clear whoever left it was not looking for any credit. She carried an armload inside and fed the fire, watching the flames lick the new wood. Her hands were trembling just a little, and not from the cold. Somebody had noticed. Somebody had helped without needing to be asked or wanting a thank you. She did not know if she should feel grateful or ashamed. The next week, Carla took Tinsley over to the Stein Ranch to deliver a load of laundry. The place was something to see. The buildings were all whitewashed, the corrals were full of good-looking horses, and the main house looked like it had been there forever. Mrs. Stein met her at the kitchen door, looked over the folded linens with a sharp eye, and paid her with coins that made a good sound in Carla's pocket. As she was heading out, holding Tinsley's hand and walking toward the wagon road, she heard the sound of a horse. She turned and saw Vance Gilmore riding in on a bay horse that looked mighty expensive, even to someone who did not know horses. He swung down near the barn, where a couple of men were waiting, probably for business. He gave her a polite nod. "Mrs. Welch." "Mr. Gilmore." Tinsley waved like her arm might come off. "Hello, do you have any little girls?" Carla wished the ground would just swallow her whole. "Tinsley, mind your manners." But Vance walked toward them, leading his horse. "No, I do not. It is just me in a house that is too big for one person." "We have a house that is too small for two people," Tinsley said, "but Mama makes it work." "I am sure she does." He looked over at Carla, and she saw a look on his face she could not quite figure. It might have been respect, or maybe just curiosity. "It is a cold day for such a long walk." "We manage," Carla said, and her voice was a little sharper than she meant it to be. He did not even blink. "I am sure you do. All the same, if you ever need a ride somewhere, my foreman comes this way 2 times a week." "We do not take charity, Mr. Gilmore." "I was not offering charity. I was offering a way to save time. But you do as you please." He tipped his hat and led his horse on toward the barn. Carla just stood there, feeling like a fool and feeling defensive all at once. Tinsley looked up at her. "Mama, why did your voice get all prickly with him?" It was not prickly. "It was. It gets like that when you are spooked." "I am not spooked by anything." "I know," Tinsley said, real quiet. "That is why it is so scary when you are." They walked the rest of the way home without a word, and that night Carla lay awake, listening to her daughter's soft breathing. She wondered why a little kindness from a stranger felt more dangerous than the hardship of a long winter. Over the next 2 weeks, little things just kept showing up. A sack of oats appeared near the chicken coop. A brand new bucket was sitting where the old one with the cracked handle used to be. One morning she found a jar of real honey on her porch step, all wrapped in brown paper with no note. Carla knew good and well who was leaving these things. She also knew she ought to march right up to him, tell him to stop, and hold on to what little pride she had left. But every single time she got it in her head to go over to the Double G Ranch and tell Vance Gilmore to leave her be, Tinsley would let out a little cough, or the wind would rattle the cabin walls, or she would just look down at her own chapped hands and the words would just dry up in her throat. She kept telling herself she would only accept the help to get through the winter. When spring came, she would figure out a way to pay him back. When spring was return, she would get back on her own 2 feet. But a small part of her, a part she hardly even admitted to herself, wondered what it would be like to not have to stand all alone for once. One afternoon in early December, Carla ran into Vance at the trading post again. She had just finished arguing with the shopkeeper about the price of lamp oil when she turned around and nearly walked right into him. "Mrs. Welch," he said, putting a hand on her elbow to steady her. The touch did not last but a second, but it felt warm right through her coat. "Mr. Gilmore." She took a quick step back. "Pardon me, I was not watching where I was headed. No harm done. He was holding a list in his other hand, Jim. It looked like he was buying supplies for the ranch. How is your daughter? Her cough is getting better. Carla blinked, a little surprised he had remembered. This cold air does not help things. No, I suppose it would not. He paused like he was thinking over his next words. My housekeeper makes a real good mustard plaster. If you would like, I could have her fix one up. It always helped my sister when she was little. The mention of his sister caught Carla by surprise. It was the first real personal thing he had offered. Now that is kind, but you are not obligated to do a thing, he cut in gently. It is just an offer from one neighbor to another. We are hardly neighbors. Your ranch is a full 6 miles from my cabin. Out here on the frontier, 6 miles is close enough. A small smile touched his lips. Besides, your little girl introduced herself to me. That makes us acquainted at the very least. Carla felt the corners of her own mouth twitch, fighting a smile. She is a friendly one. She is a brave one, just like her mother. The compliment was simple and honest, and Carla found she had no defense against it. I am not brave. I am just doing what has to be done. Well, ma'am, that is the very definition of brave. He shifted his stance, looking a little less sure of himself. Mrs. Welch, I truly hope I have not offended you with the firewood and all. I did not mean to suggest you could not manage on your own. I just figured, well, everyone can use a hand now and then. Well, Carla looked at him, really looked at him. His face was open and sincere. There was no pity in his eyes, no feeling of being better than her, just a plain and honest wish to help. So you were the one leaving things? Yes, ma'am. Why? He was quiet for a long moment, then said it plain. Because I know what it is like to be cold and scared and too proud to ask for help. And because if someone had helped my mother when I was a boy, maybe things would have turned out different. The pure honesty in his voice broke down the last of Carla's walls. Mr. Gilmore? Vance, please. Call me Vance, he corrected her. The name felt new and personal on her tongue. I appreciate the kindness. I truly do, but I cannot take charity and give nothing back. It is not about pride, it is about self-respect. He gave a slow nod. I understand that. What if we call it a trade? Your daughter tells me you are the best in the territory. I need someone to take care of the linens at the ranch house. My housekeeper is getting on in years for that heavy washing. He cleared his throat. If you would take on that job, I would pay you a fair wage. The firewood and supplies could just be part of the deal. Carla's mind started turning fast. The work would be steady. The pay would be something she could count on. It meant she would have to make regular trips to his ranch, but she could take Tinsley along with her. This was real work, not a handout work. How much laundry are we talking about? Bed linens, tablecloths, personal things, once a week, maybe twice when we are busy. And the pay. He named a price that was more than fair. It was generous, but not so much that it felt like charity. Carla did the math in her head. With that money, she could buy better food, warmer clothes for Tinsley, maybe even put a little aside for a rainy day. I would need to bring my daughter with me, she said. Of course. The house has more than enough room. She can play inside where it is warm. Carla held out her hand. Then we have a deal. Vance shook it. His grip was firm and warm. I am glad. When can you start? Next week. Perfect. Come on Tuesday. I will make sure the housekeeper is expecting you. As she and Tinsley walked away from the trading post, Carla felt a strange little flutter in her chest. It was not hope. Not yet. She was not ready for that. But it felt like the beginning of a possibility. Tinsley wrote her letter on a Sunday night while Carla sat by the lamp darning socks. The little girl had asked for paper, a rare thing in their cabin, so Carla had torn a page out of an old ledger book. Tinsley worked very slowly, her tongue sticking out between her teeth as she focused, shaping each letter with care, like someone still learning how they fit together. Carla glanced over from time to time, but did not ask what she was doing. A child needs her own private thoughts, just like a grown-up. When Tinsley was done, she folded the paper neatly. On the outside, she drew 3 stick people holding hands, one tall, one in the middle, and one small. Above them, she wrote in careful letters for Santa Claus. That is lovely, sweetheart, Carla said. What did you ask him for? It is a secret, Tinsley said. It only works if you do not tell. Where did you hear that? I just know. The next morning, Tinsley was determined to go to town. A wooden box sat outside the trading post where children left their letters, believing they were on their way to the North Pole. The truth was, the shopkeeper just gathered them up at Christmas and read them out loud to give the community a good laugh. But the children did not need to know that. Carla watched Tinsley slip the letter into the box with all the seriousness of a prayer. Whatever she had asked for, it was plain to see it meant the world to her. 3 days later, that same letter was sitting on Vance Gilmore's porch. It got there by simple mistake, a careless mix-up. The shopkeeper's nephew, a boy named Austin, worked part-time delivering mail and supplies to the ranches farther out. He had grabbed a whole stack of papers from behind the counter, invoices, sale notices, and other letters, and Tinsley's had gotten shuffled in with them. When he got to the Double G Ranch, he just left the whole stack on the porch table where Vance picked up his business mail every morning. Vance found it on a Wednesday, stuck between a receipt for cattle feed and a notice about a stockman's meeting. The child's handwriting was the first thing he saw, then the drawing, and then the words. Dear Santa, please send me a father. Not for me, it is for my mama. She works so hard, and she cries when she thinks I am asleep. Other children have fathers to fix things and carry heavy loads. Mama has to do it all by herself, and her hands hurt. I do not want any toys. I just want someone to make Mama smile again, like she used to. If you cannot send a father, maybe you could send more firewood because it gets awful cold. Thank you. Tinsley Welch, age 5. Vance read that letter 3 times. He just stood there on his porch while the snow came down, holding a piece of paper that felt heavier than anything had a right to feel. He remembered being 6 years old in a little shack up in Wyoming, watching his own mother work herself down to nothing while his father drank. He remembered his sister Lily coughing, the same kind of cough he had heard from Tinsley Welch at the trading post. He remembered his mother's hands, all cracked and bleeding from washing clothes in frozen creeks. He folded the letter carefully and sat right down on the porch bench, still holding it. A little girl had written a letter to Santa Claus, asking for someone to help her mother carry her burdens. And somehow, by some miracle, it had ended up in his hands. He sat there until the cold bit deep enough to drive him inside, and even then, he took the letter to his desk. He put it in the top drawer, right where he would see it every single morning. Tuesday came cold and clear. Carla bundled Tinsley up in every warm piece of clothing they owned, and they made the walk to the Double G Ranch. Vance had offered to send his foreman with a wagon for them, but she had said no. She could still walk 6 miles. She was not helpless yet. By the time they got there, her legs ached and Tinsley's cheeks were apple red from the cold, but they had made it. Vance met them right at the door, and his face was full of a warm welcome. Come on in. Come in and get by the fire. He led them into the main room where a wonderful heat was pouring out from a huge stone fireplace. Mrs. Erickson, my housekeeper, has some hot tea ready for you. An older woman with kind eyes came in carrying a tray. You must be frozen to the bone. Sit down, dear, and this must be little Tinsley. Tinsley was too busy looking all around the room with wide eyes to answer right away. The house was bigger than any place she had ever seen. The furniture shined. Thick rugs covered the floors. Shelves were filled with books. It felt like walking into another world. It is very big, Tinsley finally said. Vance crouched down to her level. It is it not? A little too big for just me. Do you know what helps with that? What? Having visitors. It makes it feel less empty. He stood up straight and turned to Carla. The laundry room is just through here. Mrs. Erickson will show you everything. Take all the time you need to get used to where things are. The next 2 hours went by in a flash of learning where linens were kept, how Vance liked his things folded, and what needed special handling. The amount of work was large, but it was nothing she could not handle. More important, the setup was much better than what she had at the cabin. There was hot water from a real boiler, good soap, and a drying room so she would not have to freeze her fingers hanging clothes outside. When she came out, she found Tinsley sitting at the big kitchen table with Vance. They were both bent over a book. He was reading to her in his deep, gentle voice. and Tinsley was listening to every single word. Carla's heart gave a little squeeze at the sight. Her husband Thomas used to read to Tinsley just like that. She had forgotten how much her daughter must miss it. Vance looked up and smiled. "I hope you do not mind." She was asking about the books. "I do not mind at all," Carla said softly. "Thank you." "It was my pleasure." He closed the book gently. "How was the laundry room?" "More than fine. I can have everything done by Thursday if I start the washing tomorrow." "There is no rush. Take the time you need." He stood up, then seemed to pause for a second. "Mrs. Welch, Carla, I hope this arrangement works out well for the both of us, and I hope you will feel comfortable here. This old house could use a little more life in it." Something in the way he said it made her look at him more closely. He was not just being polite. He really meant it. The loneliness she had sensed back at the trading post was even clearer here, in his big house with all its quiet rooms. "I think it will work very well," she said. 2 days later, Carla came back to finish the washing. This time, Vance was working in his study when they got there, but he came out to say hello. Tinsley right away asked if he could read her another story later, and he agreed without a second thought. Carla worked steadily, feeling a real satisfaction in using good equipment on quality linens. She was folding the last of the big bed sheets when she heard loud voices coming from outside. She went to the window and saw Vance in the yard with two of his ranch hands. They were trying to get a stubborn bull into a pen, but that animal was not having any of it. She watched as Vance grabbed a rope, dug his heels into the dirt, and pulled with all his might. The bull pulled right back. Vance held his ground, the muscles in his arms straining, his hat falling off without him even noticing. For a second, it looked like he was going to win. Then the bull decided, was done fighting. The bull gave a sideways jerk. The rope flew from his hands, and Vance went down hard in a muddy patch that the morning sun had thawed out. He landed flat on his back with a big splash that sent mud everywhere. The ranch hands ran over to give him a hand up, but Vance just waved them off. He sat there for a second, looking down at himself like he could not believe it. Then he started to laugh. Carla found herself smiling, even though she had meant to stay at all business. She went back to her folding, but when Vance came inside about 20 minutes later, all cleaned up but still a little damp, she could not resist. "I saw your wrestling match with that bull." He made a face. "I was hoping nobody saw that. The bull won that round, hands down." "Thank you for that report." He poured himself a cup of coffee. "In my defense, he has got a few 100 pounds on me." "That is a poor excuse." He looked at her, surprised, and then a grin spread across his face. "I reckon it is. I will have to do better next time." "See that you do. Your reputation is on the line." They were flirting. The thought hit Carla all of a sudden. The easy way they were talking back and forth felt natural and fun and a little bit dangerous. She knew she should stop. She should get back to her work and remember her place. But Vance was looking at her with a real warmth in his gray eyes, and she found she did not want to stop at all. "You have mud on your ear," she pointed out. He raised a hand, felt for the spot, and smudged it. "No, the other one." He tried with his other hand. "You are just terrible at this." He finally gave up and leaned his body against the counter. "Should I just figure I am covered in dust from head to toe?" Carla stopped her folding and walked over to him before she could talk herself out of it. She reached a hand up and gently cleaned the spot from his jawline with her thumb. The touch was brief, but a spark jumped between them like a shock on a dry day. She pulled her hand back in a hurry. "There, you look respectable now." "Thank you," he said in a low voice. His eyes stayed on hers, and the moment seemed to stretch out forever. Carla's heart began to pound in her chest. This was a foolish idea. This was a dangerous path. "Mama," Tinsley's voice came from the next room. "Is it time to read?" The little spell was broken. Carla turned from him, feeling both thankful and sad that they were interrupted. "I should get back to this laundry," she said. Vance cleared his throat. "I will go check on Tinsley." After he was gone, Carla put her hands flat on the counter and took a deep breath. She could not afford these feelings. She could not let herself be drawn to a rich rancher who was good to her daughter, a man who looked at her like she was more than just calloused hands and a worn-out dress. But the feeling was there. Lord, help her. It surely was. The next week, on her third trip out to the ranch, Carla's attempt to show her gratitude ended in complete failure. She had stayed up late to bake a loaf of bread, wanting to bring a small gift to thank him for the good pay. The loaf looked fine enough when she wrapped it that morning. She had not tried a piece herself. That was her first mistake. She gave it to Vance around noon while Mrs. Erickson was in town visiting her sister. I made something for you to show my thanks for the job. A smile spread across Vance's face. You did not have to go and do that. He unwrapped the cloth looking at the loaf. It looks delicious. I am not much of a cook, Carla admitted, but I gave it a try. He took a knife and cut a slice, but the blade met some resistance. He pushed down with more force. The knife stopped cold, stuck right in the middle of the loaf. He worked it loose and tried again, finally sawing off a piece that looked hard enough to prop open a door. Carla watched in absolute horror as he took a bite. The muscles in his jaw worked hard. His eyes got a little wider. He chewed for a long time, with the dedication of a man trying to keep a promise. It is, he started, still chewing. Awful. Carla finished for him, feeling her face burn with shame. I was going to say it is substantial. That is a very nice word for awful. He finally managed to swallow and reach for a glass of water. It has a lot of character. It has the same feel as old saddle leather. I think I have chewed on saddle leather that was softer, he confessed, but then he looked like he was sorry he said it. I mean, but Carla was already laughing. She could not stop herself. The failure was so total. His effort to be polite was so clear that all she could do was laugh. I am a horrible cook. You are a wonderful laundress, he countered. That is not the same thing. It is more important. Clean shirts are more useful than bread. He picked up the loaf again. This could be useful for other things, though. Holding doors open, keeping papers from blowing away, or even self-defense. Tinsley came into the room just then. Mama, did you give Mr. Gilmore the bread? I did. And he ate some. He tried to, anyway. Tinsley looked at Vance with a new kind of respect. If you can survive Mama's bread, you can survive anything. Vance let out a deep, real laugh, and Carla felt her heart do a funny little flip inside her chest. He was not making fun of her. He was not trying to make her feel small. He was simply laughing with her about how silly the whole thing was. Your daughter is a very wise little girl, he said. She is a practical girl, Carla corrected, a smile still on her face. I think I will stick to washing clothes. A wise decision. He put the bread down gently, but I do appreciate the gesture. Truly the thought was much better than the bread itself. Most things are. The two of them just stood there smiling at each other like a couple of fools. It was then that Carla understood with perfect clarity that she was in deep trouble. She liked him. This was not just about being grateful for his kindness or admiring his success. She genuinely liked the man himself. She liked his sense of humor, his gentle nature, and his way of not being afraid to look a little silly. And that was the most dangerous feeling of them all. A little while later, as Carla was finishing up her work for the day, she heard a loud crash from the yard, followed by a lot of panicked squawking. She hurried to the window and saw pure mayhem. The gate to the chicken coop was wide open, and the birds were running everywhere. Vance was out there trying to herd them back in with some help from Tinsley, who had wandered outside to play. But Carla knew from experience that chickens are smarter than they appear and more stubborn than any mule. She ran out the door. Tinsley, did you open that gate? I just wanted to help feed them, Tinsley said, her face full of guilt. And now we are helping to chase them, Vance said. As he dove for a particularly quick hen, he missed and almost fell flat on his face while the chicken clucked like it had won a prize. Carla made a grab for another bird and came up with a handful of feathers. The chicken zipped right between her legs. She turned quickly, her skirt getting tangled, and she would have fallen if Vance had not reached out to catch her. We are being outsmarted by a flock of chickens, he said with a grin. You can speak for yourself. Carla pulled up her skirt, forgetting about being proper, and went after the closest hen with a new fire. She trapped it against the barn wall, lunged, and finally caught it. The bird flapped and fought. She held on tight and carried it back to the coop like a returning hero. One down, Vance hollered. Only about 15 more to go. The next 20 minutes were nothing but organized chaos. Tinsley somehow managed to coax 3 of them back just by talking to them. Vance was able to catch 2 more, though they did their best to get away. Carla managed to corner 4 others. When it was over, they were all out of breath, splattered with dust and feathers, and laughing so hard they could barely stand. Vance slid down the barn wall and sat on the ground. I have stared down cattlemen, lived through blizzards, and broken wild horses. But these chickens might just be the thing that does me in. Carla sat down next to him, too tired to worry about how it looked. They do not have any respect for a person's dignity. He gently picked a feather out of her hair. You have some battle scars. So do you. She plucked a single feather from the collar of his shirt. Their eyes met, and they were both still smiling. But the laughter slowly faded and turned into something else, something quiet and full of energy. Vance's hand was still near her cheek from when he had removed the feather. Carla's heart was beating so fast she felt sure he must hear it. Mama, Mr. Gilmore. Tinsley's voice broke the spell. I found the last one. They both looked away from each other at the same time, clearing their throats. Vance got to his feet first and held out a hand to Carla. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet, and tried not to notice how warm his hand felt in hers. We make a pretty good team, he said softly. Against chickens, at least. Well, it is a start. That night, as she lay in bed next to Tinsley, Carla finally admitted the truth she had been running from for weeks. She was falling for Vance Gilmore. This was not the sensible interest of a woman searching for a safe harbor, but a real and terrifying fall. She had no idea what to do. She did not know if he felt anything similar. She did not know if a wealthy rancher could ever truly want a poor widow with rough hands and a recipe for bread that could be used as a weapon. But she knew she could not keep pretending it was not happening. The hard winter had taught her a lot. Maybe it was time for one more lesson, that sometimes to accept a little help was to also accept a little hope. 2 days later, on Carla's next workday, Vance asked her if she would like to have some tea after the laundry was done. This was not strange, as Mrs. Erickson often made them tea. But on this day, Mrs. Erickson had already gone home for the day, and it was just Vance making the offer. I do not want to be a bother, Carla said. You are not. I am asking you. So she took a seat at his kitchen table while he tried his hand at making tea and made it badly. It was too strong and did not have near enough sugar. And they talked, really talked, about her growing up in a farm family out in Iowa. He told her about his years on cattle drives, learning the ranching business, and they talked about books they had both read and dreams they used to have before life got in the way. I wanted to be a teacher one time, Carla admitted. Before I married Thomas, I just loved reading and learning, but a woman does not get too many choices in this life. You could teach now, Vance said, if you still wanted to. I do not have the proper training. You have the smarts for it. The rest is just stuff you can learn. She looked over at him, surprised. You really think I could? I think you could do anything you set your mind to. He said it so simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Carla felt a lump form in her throat. Thomas had loved her, sure, but he had never seen her as able to do much more than keep a house. Vance looked at her like she had a future beyond just getting by. What about you? She asked. What did you used to dream of? He got quiet for a second. A family, he said, a house full of kids and noise, and someone to share it all with. He gave a sad little smile. Not very big dreams. Compared to yours, it is not less important. No, but it sure feels a lot further off. I figured I would have it by now. You are only 34, old enough to know what I want, and young enough to hope it is not too late. Their eyes met from across the table, and Carla knew they were not just talking about old dreams anymore. They were talking about what could be, about futures that might just have each other in them. It is not too late, she said in a soft voice, for either of us. Vance reached his hand across the table and took hers. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, so gentle on her calloused skin. Carla, I have to tell you something. Her heart started to pound in her chest. All right, I read your daughter's letter, the one she wrote to Santa Claus. Carla froze solid. What? It somehow ended up on my porch, mixed in with some ranch papers. He held her hand a little tighter when she tried to pull away. Please, just let me finish. She stopped trying to get away, but she was still tense. She asked Santa to send her a father, Vance said. Not for toys, but for someone to help her mama, someone to make you smile again. His voice was heavy with feeling. Carla, I know what it feels like to be that kid, watching your parent work themselves to the bone just to survive. My own sister died because we could not afford to get her any help. My mother worked herself right into an early grave, and I swore to myself if I ever got the money, I would never let someone suffer like that if I could do something about it. Tears started to well up in Carla's eyes. So this was just pity. All of it. No, his voice was firm. It started out as me wanting to help, but then it turned into something else. He stood up and walked around the table, kneeling down beside her chair. It turned into me admiring your strength and getting fond of your daughter's bright little spirit. And somewhere in all that, I fell in love with a woman who bakes bread tough enough to stop a bullet, fights off chickens with pure dignity, and makes me truly laugh for the first time in years. Carla just stared at him, feeling like she could not draw a breath. You are in love with me? Completely and hopelessly. He gave a nervous smile. Is that speaking too far out of turn? She thought about all the times she had made up excuses just to get a look at him. How her heart always felt a little lighter when she saw his ranch on the horizon. How safe she felt whenever he was around. How Tinsley had just blossomed with his attention. How empty her little cabin felt now compared to the warmth of this house. Not if I feel the same way, she whispered. His eyes went wide. Do you? Instead of giving him an answer, she put her hands on his face and kissed him. It was nothing like the shy, careful touches they had shared before. This was months of holding back finally let loose. His hands went to her waist, pulling her in closer. She ran her fingers through his hair, knocking his chair over as she slid down to meet him. When they finally pulled apart, both of them trying to catch their breath, Vance rested his forehead against hers. Dear Santa, please send me a father, he quoted softly. Best letter I ever did receive. Carla laughed through her tears. My daughter is a whole lot smarter than the two of us. She knew what you needed before you ever did. What we both needed. He kissed her again, slower this time, like he was savoring it. Stay for dinner. Stay a while longer. Stay forever, she finished for him. I was going to say for as long as you want, but forever works just fine too. From the doorway, Tinsley's voice made them both jump. Are you two kissing? Carla pulled back, her face red. Tinsley, how long have you been standing there? Long enough to know Santa Claus is real. Tinsley grinned wide, and that he looks a lot like Mr. Gilmore. Vance laughed and got to his feet, helping Carla up. Come here, you clever little girl. Tinsley ran right to them, and Vance scooped her up into his arms. She wrapped her arms tight around his neck and said, Real serious, does this mean you are going to be my papa? Vance looked at Carla, who nodded, tears in her eyes. If that is all right with you, he said to Tinsley. I would be honored. It is all right with me. She hugged him even tighter. I asked for you special. Well then, I had better do a good job. You already are. And standing there in that warm kitchen, with the snow falling down outside, and the three of them all wrapped up together, Carla finally understood what hope felt like after so many years of just trying to survive. December brought a cold that got deep into your bones and just refused to leave. Tinsley's cough, which had gotten better for a little while, came back with a fury. By the second week of the month, she had a high fever, was struggling for every breath, and Carla was plain terrified. She had tried everything she knew how to do. Steam from boiling in water, willow bark tea, poultices on her little chest. Nothing was helping. Tinsley got weaker every day, her small body shaking with coughs that sounded like they were tearing her apart from the inside. Vance had asked her to marry him the week before. After courting her properly with long rides around his property, dinners at his house, and quiet talks about what their future could be, she had said yes without a second of doubt, her heart just full of certainty. They had made plans to get married in the spring, but now spring felt a lifetime away. All that mattered was the sound of Tinsley's ragged breathing. On the fourth night, Carla finally broke. She wrapped Tinsley in every single blanket they owned, lifted her up, my God, she weighed nothing, and carried her out through the dark toward the one place she had sworn she would never go for help. The Double G Ranch was 6 miles away. Carla walked every step of it with Tinsley whimpering against her shoulder, her own tears freezing on her face. She did not care about her pride anymore. She just cared about breathing, about her daughter's breath keeping on past this night. She got to the ranch house close to midnight. Lamplight was glowing in the windows. She stumbled up the porch steps and pounded on the door with her fist. shouting out Vance's name. The door swung open. He stood there in a loose shirt and trousers, barefoot, his hair a mess. His whole look changed the second he saw them. "She cannot breathe," Carla said, her voice cracking. "I tried everything. I do not know what else to do." He did not waste time with questions. He lifted Tinsley from Carla's arms as careful as could be and carried her inside to a room where a fire was already burning bright. He laid her down on a sofa and checked her over quick, his hands gentle but sure. "How long has she been like this?" he asked. "4 days. It is just getting worse. You should have come to me sooner." "I know." Carla was shaking all over. Now, the exhaustion and the fear and the cold all hit her at once. Vance looked right at her. "Sit down before you fall down. I will handle this." For the first time in 2 long years, Carla did what someone told her to do without a single question. She sank down into a chair and just watched him work. He boiled water and made a steam tent with some blankets, holding Tinsley upright so her little lungs could drain. He moved with a kind of skill that told you he had done this before, and something about how steady he was let Carla's terror ease up just a little bit. Hours went by. Tinsley's breathing got easier. The fever broke right around dawn. She finally fell into a deep, real sleep, her little hand curled up against Vance's chest where he sat holding her. Carla finally spoke, her voice just a whisper. "How did you know what to do?" Vance did not look up at her. He kept his eyes on Tinsley, and you could not read his face at all. "I had a sister, Lily. She died when I was 12. Pneumonia. We could not afford the doctor, could not afford any medicine. My mother did everything you did. Steam, tea, prayers. It just was not enough." The words fell into the quiet room like stones dropping into still water. "I am so sorry," Carla whispered. "I swore after that happened that I would never be helpless again. I learned everything I could about treating sickness, about medicines, about what works and what does not." He finally looked over at her, his eyes holding a mix of old hurts and fresh resolve. "Your little girl is not going to die because you could not afford a doctor. Not on my watch." Carla felt something break loose inside her. "Why would you care about us?" "Because I know exactly what it feels like to watch someone you love fade away because of poverty." He took a breath. "And because a little girl wrote a letter to Santa Claus asking for someone to help lighten her mama's burden. Now, I might not be Santa, but I can sure as heck try to be." The air between them crackled with feelings neither of them could put a name to. Carla got to her feet and walked to where he sat. She knelt down by the sofa, her face even with his, and said softly, "I am so sorry I did not come for help sooner. I am sorry I let my pride nearly cost Tinsley her life. Sometimes pride is all a person has got. It kept you on your feet when most folks would have crumbled. It also keeps people lonely." He met her gaze. "You are not lonely anymore, and you will not ever be again if I have anything to say about it." Carla reached out a hand and slowly laid it over his, which was resting on Tinsley's back. His hand felt warm and calloused. It felt real. "I do not know how to do this," she confessed. "I do not know how to let somebody help me without feeling like I am failing." "You are not failing. You are holding on through something that would have broken most people. I am just tired of holding on." "Then it is time to stop." His voice was soft but solid. "Stop trying to carry the whole world by yourself. Let me help you. Let me be the answer to that letter. Not because you need saving, but because everybody deserves to have a partner in this life." Tears started to run down Carla's cheeks, quiet and clean. "What if I cannot be the person you need? You already are. You are strong and kind and so brave. You are a wonderful mother. You make me laugh. You push me to be better. Just having you in this house makes it feel like a home." He paused for a moment. "What else could I possibly need?" She leaned in and gave him a kiss that was soft and thankful and full of feelings too big to say out loud. When she pulled away, she whispered, "I love you. I love you too." He gently wiped the tears from her face. "Now you get some rest. I will keep an eye on things." So she curled up in the big chair next to them and finally let herself sleep, knowing that someone else was standing guard for once. Tinsley woke up around noon, a little groggy but breathing easy. She looked around the strange room, confused, until she saw Vance and broke into a smile. "Did Santa Claus send you?" "Something like that," he told her. "I told Mama he would." Carla, who had been sleeping lightly in the chair, stirred and woke up. "How are you feeling, my sweet girl?" hungry, and Mr. Gilmore's house smells an awful lot like bacon. Vance let out a laugh. Well, I think we can take care of that. He cooked them a real breakfast with eggs and bacon and toast slathered in butter. Carla just watched him, how he knew his way around the kitchen like he was born in it, and she felt a stir of desire right alongside her gratitude. It was not just for his body, though that was there too, but for a true partner, for someone to share the heavy loads, for a man who would look at her daughter with that same protective love. After they ate, he insisted they stay at the ranch until Tinsley was all the way better. Carla tried to argue just a little, but Vance just led them to a guest room that had a bed big enough for the both of them and clean sheets that smelled like lavender. Rest, he said. I mean really rest. The world is not going to fall apart if you stop holding it up for a couple of days. That afternoon, while Tinsley was sleeping like a stone, Vance took Carla aside. I want to move the wedding day up. She just blinked at him. What? I do not want to wait for spring. I want you right here where I know you are both safe and warm, where Tinsley can get proper medicine if she ever needs it again, where you do not have to walk 6 miles in the snow just to do your laundry. He took both of her hands in his. I want you to be my wife now, as soon as we can manage it. Folks are going to talk. They will say we did it in a hurry. Let them talk. I do not give a damn about gossip. I care about you and I care about Tinsley. His voice was fierce. I almost lost her tonight. I am not going to risk that ever again. Carla felt her heart just about burst. You really want this? More than anything. Then yes, let's not wait. He pulled her into his arms and held on to her like she was something precious. He had been searching for his whole life and had finally found. That night, long after Tinsley was asleep, Carla found Vance sitting in his study, reading a book by the light of a lamp. She stood there in the doorway, feeling a little unsure. He looked up. Can't sleep? I'm not used to a bed being that comfortable. She took a step into the room. And I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about your sister. He put his book down. That was a long time back, but it does not mean it stopped hurting. Yes. He was quiet for a second. I have spent 20 years trying to make up for the fact that I could not save her. Building up all this, learning about medicine, helping folks where I can, but it never really fills that empty space, you know? Carla walked over and sat on the corner of his big desk. Nothing ever will. Losing someone just does not work like that. But maybe you can honor her memory by living a full life, by letting yourself be happy, by building that family you always dreamed of. I like the sound of that. He stood up and stepped right between her knees, putting his hands on her waist. I like that sound very much. She wrapped her arms right around his neck. Show me. He kissed her then, and this kiss was different from the ones before. This one was deeper, more sure of itself, and full of promises for tomorrow. His hands slid up her sides and she leaned into his touch, feeling desire rush through her like a flash flood. Carla, he whispered against her lips, if we keep this up, I am not going to be able to stop. Then do not stop. His eyes got darker. We are not married yet. We will be soon enough. And I am tired of waiting. I am tired of being so careful. She pulled back just enough to look him right in the eye. I want you. I want this. I want to feel alive for once instead of just surviving. Something inside him finally let go. He lifted her right off the desk and carried her over to the sofa, setting her down gently. The lamplight made golden shadows dance across his face, showing the fire in his eyes as he traced a finger along her collarbone, sending a shiver all the way through her. She pulled him down to her hands learning the hard, strong lines of his back, pulling him closer until their bodies moved together in a rhythm that was all their own. His mouth found hers again, and his touch got bolder, slipping under her clothes to wake up every part of her with slow, deliberate purpose. She gasped into his kiss as the heat built between them, her legs wrapping around him without a thought, drawing him into that intimate place where want and need finally met. Their bodies moved in a raw, honest dance, his strength guiding her to peaks of feeling that left her shaking, her fingers digging into his shoulders as a powerful release crashed over her. He followed just a moment later, his breath coming in ragged gasps against her skin. Their connection was deep and solid, a mix of tenderness and wild passion that tied them together for good. They stayed like that for a long while after, tangled up in each other as the quiet of the study wrapped around them. He trailed soft, lazy kisses along her neck, lighting little fires even as they both felt the sweet pull of exhaustion. Later, wrapped up in his shirt and in his arms, Carla said in a low voice, "I never thought I would feel this way again. Happy and safe and wanted." "Well, you better get used to it," he said, kissing her shoulder, "because I aim to make you feel wanted every single day for the rest of our lives." She turned in his arms to look at him. "I love you. I do not tell you that enough. You can say it as much as you want. I will never get tired of hearing it. I love you," she said again. "I love your kindness and your strength. I love the way you look at my daughter like she is already your own. The way you make me laugh. The way you make me feel like I am more than just a pair of working hands. You are so much more." That, he held her face in his hands. "You are smart and brave and so beautiful. You are everything I never knew I was waiting for." They made love again, this time much slower, enjoying every single touch and every whispered word. When they were finally too tired to move, they fell asleep all tangled up together, feeling safe knowing they had found something special, something worth holding on to. They got married 3 weeks later in the little church in Clement Springs. The service was simple. It was no big to-do, just the minister, a couple of friends, and Mrs. Erickson, who dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Tinsley stood right between them, holding both of their hands. Vance promised to love, protect, and be a true partner to Carla. She promised him the same. And when he kissed his new wife, Tinsley let out a cheer so loud it made everyone in the church laugh. "I told you Santa was real," she announced with pride. They moved into the main ranch house that same week. Carla walked through all the rooms that had once felt so lonely and began to fill them up with life again. She put up curtains, moved the furniture around, and made the spaces her own. Tinsley would run down the hallways, shouting just to hear the sound of her own voice bounce off the walls. She was thrilled by how big it was. Mrs. Erickson stayed on to help keep the house, but Carla took over most of the cooking, herself except for the bread. They both agreed that Vance would be in charge of that from now on. Their days fell into a rhythm that just felt right. They had breakfast together, worked during the day, had Tinsley's school lessons in the afternoon, and ate dinner as a family. Their evenings were spent by the fire, and at night they were together in the bedroom they now shared. Vance made love to his wife with a kind of devotion that only grew deeper the more they knew one another. "Tell me what you want," he whispered against her skin one night. "You," she whispered right back. "Always just you." And he gave her exactly that, a passion he showed through his touch, through his soft words, and through the careful way he always paid attention to her pleasure. Carla learned that desire does not just die because of hard times. It simply waits for a safe moment to come back. One evening, she gave him a surprise by showing up in the doorway of their bedroom wearing nothing but his shirt. His eyes turned dark in an instant. "Mrs. Gilmore," he said, his voice a little rough, "are you trying to pull me away from my book?" she asked. "Is it working?" He set the book down completely. She walked over to him slowly, enjoying the way his eyes followed her every move. "Good." He pulled her down onto his lap, and his hands slid right under the shirt to touch her bare skin. The warmth of his hands started a fire deep inside her, and his fingers traced sensitive lines on her skin that made her catch her breath. She moved against him, feeling how hard he was, pressing against her insistently, and she deliberately ground down, making a low groan come from his throat. His touch became more urgent, exploring all her curves and hollows, sending little shocks of electricity racing through her. Their bodies moved together in a heated grind that built up tension with every single shift. She took his mouth in a fierce kiss, her hands moving over his chest, her nail grazing him just enough to make the feeling stronger. He answered by lifting her just a bit, guiding them together with a steady thrust that filled her completely. Their movements found a raw, steady pace. Waves of pleasure built up without stopping, and her inner muscles clenched around him as he pushed deeper. Each movement pulled gasps and moans from them that filled the quiet room. The feeling peaked in shuddering climaxes, her body arching against his as release washed over them in powerful surges, leaving them both out of breath and tangled together. "You are going to be the death of me. But what a way to go." They made love with both laughter and desire, and afterward, they lay wrapped up in the sheets, full of contentment. Carla thought she had never been happier in her entire life. Vance took to being a father with the same steady capability he brought to everything else. He taught Tinsley how to ride, starting her off on a gentle mare named Clover, and spent hours patiently teaching her. He helped her with her schoolwork, explaining arithmetic in ways that she could finally understand. He tucked her into bed at night, listened to her say her prayers, and promised her he was not going anywhere. One evening, about 6 weeks after the wedding, Tinsley climbed up into his lap while he was reading the newspaper. "Can I call you Papa?" A lump formed in his throat. "You can call me anything you want to, sweetheart. I want to call you Papa, because that is what you are." He held her close to him and had to blink back tears. "Then Papa it is." Carla watched them from the doorway, with one hand resting gently on her lower belly. Nothing was showing just yet, but in her heart, she already knew. She had not told him yet. She wanted to wait for the perfect moment. That night in bed, she took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "We are having a baby." Vance became very still. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He pulled her into his arms, buried his face in her hair, and she could feel him trembling. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for choosing this, for choosing me, for giving me a real family. We are building it together," she corrected him gently. "This is ours." "Ours," he repeated, like it was a sacred promise. Their son was born in the late autumn, right as the first snow began to fall. The labor was difficult, but Carla was strong, and when the baby finally came, Vance held him with shaking hands and cried openly. They named him Ellis, after Carla's father. Tinsley took to her new role as a big sister with a fierce kind of protectiveness. She helped change him, sang songs to him, and insisted on holding him every chance she got. The house was soon filled with all the sounds of a baby, the crying, the cooing, and all the soft noises that come with a new life. One afternoon, while Ellis was taking a nap and Tinsley was playing outside, Carla found Vance in the nursery, just standing there watching their son sleep. "You are going to spoil him," she said in a soft voice. "Probably." He did not look away from Ellis. "I keep thinking about my own father, how he threw away everything he had, how he chose the bottle over us. And I swear to myself every single day that I will not make those same mistakes." Carla wrapped her arms around him from behind. "You will not. You are nothing like him. How can you be so sure? Because you chose love. Every single day you wake up and you choose us. That is what makes all the difference." He turned around in her arms and gave her a deep kiss. "I love you. All of you. This life we are building. We love you too." The ranch did very well over the next few years. Vance expanded the herds, bought more land, and built a second barn. But what was more important, he brought Carla into the business as a full partner. She had a real head for numbers and a sharp eye for making good deals. Together, they made the Double G one of the most successful ranches in the whole Montana territory. Carla traded in her rough work dresses for nicer ones, but she never once forgot where she came from. She hired some help for the house, not to replace her own work, but to give her time for things she had never had time for before, like reading, riding horse just for fun, or simply resting. She also began teaching, not in a real school, but giving lessons to the children from the ranches farther out whose parents could not afford to hire private tutors. She taught them reading, writing, and arithmetic, and she found out she had a real gift for it. Vance turned a room in their house into a small classroom, and twice a week children would show up for their lessons. Tinsley helped out sometimes, reading to the younger students or showing them how to do their arithmetic problems. She was 11 now, a bright and confident girl with her father's determination and her mother's kind heart. 2 years after Ellis was born, their daughter arrived. They named her Lily after Vance's sister. She had dark hair and gray eyes just like her father, and a stubborn streak that made both of them laugh. "She is going to be trouble," Vance said as he cradled his tiny daughter. "She is going to be strong," Carla corrected him, "just like her namesake. I like that better." Their bedroom stayed a place of passion and closeness. Being married made their physical connection even deeper instead of dulling it. Vance touched his wife as if she was the most precious thing in the world, and she always responded with the same passion. One night, after all the children were asleep, Carla surprised him by locking their bedroom door and pulling out a bottle of brandy she had hidden away. "What is this?" he asked, looking amused. "A celebration? It is our 5-year anniversary." "Is it?" He thought for a moment. "So it is." She poured 2 glasses and handed one to him. "5 years since you read a letter that changed your entire life. The best accident of my life." They took a drink. Then Carla set her glass down and started to unbutton his shirt. "I want to celebrate properly." His eyes got darker. "How properly?" "Very." She made love to him with a confidence that came from years of knowing exactly. "Again," she said back with a little smile. And he did, thoroughly. Ellis grew up to be a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved horses and books just the same. He had his daddy's gray eyes and his mama's steady determination. Lily was the noisy one, always jumping into things head first, but she had so much charm that it was hard to ever stay mad at her. Tinsley blossomed into a smart and capable young woman, and she was already turning the heads of the boys in town. Vance took this news about as well as you would expect any daddy to, which is to say, not well at all. "He is 17, Vance said, pacing back and forth in his study. "What business does a boy like that have with my daughter?" Carla hid her smile. "To court her, I imagine. She is too young. She is 16. I was 18 when I married Thomas. That is different." "How is it different?" "It just is." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "She is my little girl." Carla went over and put her arms around him. "She is growing up, Vance. We cannot stop it. We can only trust that we raised her right enough to make good choices." He let out a big sigh. "I do not like it. I know you do not. But we have to let her go sometime." Finally, and not very happily, Vance agreed to let the young man, Dawson Conrad, the son of one of the ranch hands, come calling on Tinsley, but only under very strict supervision. With a clock ticking loud enough for everyone in the room to hear it, Carla figured. It was the sweetest thing, how he watched over her. Their life settled down into something real and special. They had coffee together every morning. Vance was teaching Ellis the ways of the ranch. Carla was teaching Lily how to read. Tinsley helped out with the younger children. Family dinners were always full of talk and laughter. In the evenings, they would walk around the property. Now, they had their disagreements, sure. Carla sometimes thought Vance was a little too hard on Ellis. Vance worried Carla was wearing herself out with her teaching. They saw things differently on discipline, on money, on a dozen little things. But they always talked it out, always found their way back to each other, and always remembered what they had been through to build this life. One evening, 14 years after they'd gotten married, Vance found Carla in her little classroom, putting books in order. He just leaned there in the doorway watching her. "What?" she asked, feeling his eyes on her. "Just admiring my wife." "After 14 years?" "Especially after 14 years, he said. He walked over and pulled her into his arms. "You're even prettier than the day I married you. You're a terrible liar. I am 100% serious." He kissed her temple. "You're happy. It shows." She leaned against him. "I am happy. So happy it's almost a shame." Good, that was the whole idea. They stood there in a comfortable quiet, surrounded by books and all the signs of the life they had built. And Carla said a quiet prayer, thanking the good Lord for the accident that brought them together. On a December night with snow falling soft and quiet 15 years after that first letter, Vance found it while he was looking for some ranch papers. He sat at his desk and read it one more time, the paper soft and worn from being read so many times. Carla came and stood in the doorway. "What are you reading?" He held it up, the letter that had set it all in motion. She came over and read it over his shoulder, a smile on her face. She knew exactly what she was asking for. Smart girl. She's 20 now, getting married next summer to that Conrad boy. Don't remind me, but Vance was smiling. Though I suppose if she had to pick someone, Dawson is a good boy. He treats her like gold, just like he ought to. Carla sat on the corner of his desk. It's hard to wrap your head around how one little piece of paper could change so much. He pulled her onto his lap. "I'd probably still be rattling around this house, acting like being alone was all a man needed. And I'd still be in that little cabin, thinking that just getting by was the same as truly living." "Thank God for accidents. Thank God for answered prayers," she corrected him. From upstairs, they heard the sounds of the younger children squabbling. That was Ellis, 13 now, and Lily, who was 11, fussing over something silly. Then they heard Tinsley's voice, calm and steady, settling the whole thing down. Vance stood up, lifting Carla right along with him. She wrapped her arms around his neck. "Where are we going?" "To go remind our kids that their mom and dad are still mighty fond of each other. They know that. Let's just make sure." He carried her up the stairs, past the children's rooms, and into their own bedroom, where the lamp cast a warm glow. He set her down easy and closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. They made love with a slow tenderness, enjoying every single moment, every touch, every whispered word. The years had taught him to be patient. Life had taught him what the other one needed without a word being said. And love, the deep and steady kind you choose to build, made every touch count. Later, as they lay wrapped up together, Carla said softly, "You reckon she knew when she wrote that letter?" "Knew what?" "That the Santa she was writing to was just a lonely cowboy who needed saving every bit as much as we did." Vance was quiet for a second, his fingers drawing little circles on her shoulder. "Maybe. Or maybe she just believed so hard that the good Lord was listening. I'm sure glad he did. Me too, every single day." On Christmas morning, the whole family gathered in the parlor. It was a tradition they had kept for all those years. Everybody opened their gifts together. The whole house was just filled with happy noise and laughter. Tinsley, now a young woman getting ready for her own wedding, was helping Ellis and Lily with their presents. She had grown into a remarkable person, kind and smart and sure of herself, just the kind of person she'd hoped to be in that childhood letter. Vance and Carla sat close on the sofa, watching their children. Their hands were joined together. The house was warm. The fire was burning bright in the hearth. Outside, the snow covered everything in a clean, forgiving white. "Do you remember," Carla said in a low voice, "when the winters felt like they were trying to break you?" "I remember," Vance said. "It feels different now, 'cause we're not facing it by ourselves anymore." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for reading that letter. Thank you for being brave enough to write back. Thank you for being brave enough to let me." Tinsley looked over at him and just smiled. It was the same smile she had as a 5-year-old girl writing her hopes down on a piece of paper. She walked over to them and said quietly, "I'm so glad you two found each other." "So are we, sweetheart," Carla said. "So are we." Ellis brought over a small wrapped gift. "Papa, this is for you and Mama, from all of us." Vance unwrapped it with care. Inside was a framed copy of the original letter, carefully mounted and safe behind a piece of glass. Tinsley had added a note at the bottom in her grown-up handwriting. "The best prayer I ever said. Thank you both for proving that hope is not a foolish thing. It is just patient. With love, Tinsley." Vance's eyes started to water up. He stood and pulled Tinsley into a big, strong hug. "Thank you for writing it, for giving me a chance to be your papa." "Thank you for saying yes," she whispered back. The rest of the day was just full of warmth and good times. Dinner was a feast. They had roasted turkey, potatoes, pie made with apples they'd put up, and plenty of Vance's good bread. The table was crowded, the talk was loud, and you could feel the love in the room. As evening came and the children started getting sleepy, Vance stood by the window, looking out at his snow-covered ranch. Carla came and stood with him, slipping her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked him. "I spent so many years in this house, thinking that I liked being alone. And then a letter showed up, and the whole world changed." He turned to her and held her face in his hands. "I found you. I found us. I finally learned what a real home feels like." She kissed him, a kiss that was soft and sure. "Well then, I'm sure glad we found you. I'm glad you let me find you." Behind them, Tinsley started to read. It was the night before Christmas, and she was reading it to her younger brother and sister, her voice clear and sure, just like Carla's had been all those years ago in that old cabin that was long gone now. The fire crackled in the hearth. The house settled into its evening peace. And if anybody had ever asked Vance Gilmore if he regretted answering a little girl's letter to Santa, the answer was plain to see in every corner of that warm house, in every laugh from his children, in every touch from his wife. Some prayers just drift away, but others, well, they land right where they are supposed to. And when a man finally understands what love really is, the kind that is patient and chosen, built on hard times you face together and being honest with each other. He holds on tight and does not ever let go. Because losing a woman like Carla Welch or a family like the one they had would be the kind of regret a man would carry with him to his grave. But Vance Gilmore had no plans of ever finding that out. He had everything he had ever needed, all wrapped up in the happy noise and warmth of a family that started with a letter from a hopeful little girl. And for the first time in his whole life, winter felt like a gift instead of a fight. Carla pulled him away from the window. "Come on, let's go sit with our family." "Our family," he said back, liking the sound of those words. Yes, they went back to the warm circle of their children, and as the snow kept on falling outside, covering the whole world in a quiet blanket of white, the ranch house just glowed with light and love. It was a story about a rancher who was all alone, a widow who was just trying to get by, and a little girl brave enough to ask for a miracle. And it was about a letter that found its way home.